So today we're going to be talking about Roslin Chapel and Scottish Antiquaries, which is the name of our current exhibition display in the building. But before we start that, I'm just going to talk a little bit about Historic Environment Scotland, who we are and what we do. So Historic Environment Scotland is the lead public body established to investigate, care for and promote Scotland's historic environment. So you can see online, part of that is looking after our properties in care. So those of you who are familiar with the Historic Scotland membership, that's one of our brands essentially. We monitor things like scheduled monuments, we survey and record places around Scotland. We have over 5 million manuscripts and photographs and drawings in the archive. And our websites, if any of you are familiar with Canmore or Scran, our websites have over 1 million visits. I think that's maybe a month, a month. But so our online presence is just as important as our physical presence and the ability to see us in person. So the Historic Environment Scotland Archive, the HES Archive, we are based here at John Sinclair House. This is a working building, so as you're leaving today or as you're looking around the display, you might see people moving around trolleys of collections. We will, in a couple of years' time, be moving to a new archive store out at Bonnyrigg, but our public services, our library and our search room are moving to Longmore House, which is our other headquarter building, not very far from here. So our services will still be in the city. So what kind of things can you find in the archives? This is just a little snapshot, really. So survey and recording, these are the things that our predecessor, one of our predecessors' bodies, the Royal Commission, and we still do as part of Historic Environment Scotland, go out and survey and record Scotland's environment. We have archaeological survey. So we receive deposits of archive information from archaeology companies, organisations, individuals all over Scotland. Those can be images of buildings, images of sites, they can be data, they can be written reports, they can also be pictures of trenches. Pictures of trenches and then accompanying information about what they found or didn't find inside them. We have really strong holdings of architectural archives, so holdings of particular architectural practices. Some of our significant collections, Robert Rowand Anderson, the records of Lorimer and Matthew architects. So on the top right here, we've got a plan of Marchmont House gardens and glass houses. We also have papers of Basil Spence, for example. We have deposited collections. So those are collections that we look after on behalf of the people that own them. And one of the most substantial ones is the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. And I mentioned that because we're going to be talking about them quite a bit today. And this is a painting by James Drummond, who is another member of the Society who we're going to come across during the talk today. For those of you who are here in person, the captions for the images are a little bit small. We're very happy to send slides out to you afterwards if you have any further questions. We also have really strong holdings of historic photography. And again, we're going to be talking about those in the context of Roslin and the 19th century during the talk. This one here is by Erskine Beveridge, and it's images, a photograph of houses in Shoregate from around 1885. And then on the bottom right-hand corner is Scran. So Scran is one of the websites that we manage and look after, and Scran has photographs of collections from all over the UK, other museums and organisations, really relating more to the social history of Scotland. And it's a really important educational resource as well. A lot of these are our physical archives. So we talked about our having sort of 5 million objects. We have a digital archive, a really large digital archive. So I mentioned about archaeological surveys coming in. A lot of these are digital photographs, digital reports, large data sets. And our digital archive is at about 88 terabytes in size at the moment. So it's a really, really substantial size. So I'm going to start off with just a bit of background to Roslin Chapel itself. And I'm aware that we have someone that works at Roslin Chapel here today, so if I get any facts wrong, you can correct me. So around 1450, yes, no problem. Sir William Sinclair founded the Collegiate Church of St Matthew in Roslin. So the church is dedicated to St Matthew. You'll notice that there are a couple of spellings of Roslin. When we generally in my talk, when I refer to the chapel, I use the spelling Rosslyn. When I refer to the town is Roslin. But sometimes it's spelled a little bit differently when we refer to the chapel, and that's because it's a quotation from somebody writing about it in the past. In 1484, Sir William died and building work ceased, and this becomes a little bit of a theme for buildings built around this time. They were obviously very expensive. They relied on the patronage of an individual, and when he died, it just stopped. And we'll talk a little bit later about what part of the building was built and what part of the building wasn't built. In 1592, following the Reformation, the altars were destroyed. You can still, if you go today, you can see some of the remnants of where the altars would have been. And then in 1650, so it's had an interesting life, the chapel. During the Anglo-Scottish War, General Monk stabled his horses in the chapel. And I think that's after an attack on the town itself. And General Monk was one of Cromwell's generals. 1688, the sculptural decoration had further damaged when a mob from Edinburgh and Lothian attacked the chapel to destroy the idolatrous sculptural decoration. There's one thing, anyone who's visited Roslin knows, there's a lot of sculptural decoration, there's a lot of people portrayed, and that was very much what this mob was attacking. Here we've got some images from the Roslin Chapel Trust, who've provided them for us. Beautiful, beautiful sunny day in the top left-hand corner. And the other photographs really remind us that it's a huge tourist and visitor attraction, but it's also a working church with a congregation that worships in it. So the thing that prompted our exhibition and this talk is the Rosslyn Chapel Album. The album was acquired by HES, Historic Environment Scotland, in 2021, and it was up for auction. We received a grant from Friends of the National Libraries, which is a UK-wide charity, and we received support from the Roslin Chapel Trust. And you might think, well, why is it here instead of at the Trust? The Trust doesn't have a collection as such where you can go and look at a secure environment to look at it. But part of the sort of agreement for getting it was that we were going to digitize it and conserve it, and I'll talk about that. The album is first recorded anywhere in 1857. It was a lot in an auction of John Britton's library, and the album itself is an album collated by John Britton. It was sold to an unknown buyer, and then it appears in the library of Sir Hugh Hamilton Dalrymple. Sir Hugh Hamilton Dalrymple lived from 1814 to 1887. His bookplate is still in the album. At some point, it passed on to Canon George Hebb Taylor. He was chaplain at Roslin Chapel until 1963, and it remained in his family's ownership until it came up for sale in 2021. So when the album arrived with us, and I should say the album is on display in the entrance foyer as you come in. We turn the pages every couple of weeks because obviously there's a lot of natural light there. We need to be careful not to damage the paper. But when it arrived, it was in a very, very fragile state. So the first thing we did was undertake conservation work. So here is one of our conservators, Lynn, doing some surface cleaning, but the entire album was unbound, bound back together with support from a specialist book conservator. Some of the pages were mended, and it's in a much more stable condition now. We've also digitized it, so you can look at the whole album online. And we've also catalogued it now. So it's not available online yet, but one of our archivists has actually transcribed all the letters in it. This is one of the letters. So I'm very grateful that she transcribed most of it, because my paleography skills are not really good enough for reading that. This is a letter, one of the letters contained within, from 1806, a letter from Joseph Michael Gandy to John Britton himself. So the album, it's a collection of drawings, manuscripts, engravings, and it was assembled by John Britton. John Britton was a publisher, an antiquarian. He lived from 1771 to 1857, and everything in the album relates to the architecture and restoration of Roslin Chapel. And it includes correspondence with some key people. And what I'm going to show through the presentation, and we show through the exhibition, is how relevant this album is to the other holdings in the archive here at HES. So it includes correspondence with architects William Byrne, George Michael Kemp, artists Joseph Gandy and David Roberts, and also John R. Thompson, who was custodian of the chapel from 1837 to 1921. And it also includes 12 original drawings by Gandy, 3 by Roberts, and 1 by Thompson, as well as lots of prints that he cut out from publications. So Britton was a really notable topographer. He wrote numerous surveys of England and Wales, and his sort of big accomplishment was a 5-volume series on the architectural antiquities of Great Britain. It was published from 1807 to 1827, and it only features one Scottish location, and that is Roslin Chapel. The engravings in his book were created from drawings by Joseph Michael Gandy, which is why some of his drawings and correspondence is in this volume. And that's another reason it's really important that this volume is now in a public collection and made fully accessible. Joseph Michael Gandy, in another museum in London, there is a sketchbook by him with lots of his drawings of Roslin Chapel, and they have gaps in them. And it was only when this album was researched, I think in the early 2000s, that actually these gaps were now filled in from these items. So the earliest letter in the album is from 1806, and that's this one here from Joseph Michael Gandy to John Britton himself. Gandy, essentially, he went and surveyed the chapel. So he visited, he took drawings and measurements, both artistic drawings, plans, elevations, and those became the drawings that were for the publication. And in this letter, he's commenting on how accurate John Sleezer's drawings of Roslin Chapel were, and that was from a 1693 publication. And he's sort of commenting on whether or not those are accurate, where the differences are, and the print from Sleezer's book is one of the prints that's been cut out and pasted into the Roslin Chapel album. So on the 12th of January 1846, Britton presented a lecture at the Royal Institute for British Architects, and it was all on the architecture of Roslin Chapel. And this volume includes some of his preparatory notes. There is no full written record of his presentation. RIBA archives have the notes by an architect who attended it, but it's not a verbatim script. It's not very detailed notes either. So part of his preparatory notes of his presentation say, in design, this building manifests some originality and detail, but a repetition of former churches in its general plan and arrangement. We are not informed of the whole plan and design, but may reasonably support the architect intended to make a complete church. And we actually know that they did, because the foundations of the rest of the church have been identified. However, what might seem like a really simple presentation caused uproar. And much of the correspondence in this volume is about the repercussions from Britton's Reba lecture, where he ignited arguments about the history of the chapel, its renovations, and the conflicting stories around it. And we're going to be looking at some of those there. But first, I want to talk a bit about antiquaries and antiquarianism. So antiquarianism is collecting, recording, organising and presenting information on and actual artefacts from the past. It's much very closely related to what we do with museums from the 19th century onwards. And there are two key societies in Britain. So the Society of Antiquaries of London was founded in 1707, which was also the Act of Union. And the business of this society should be limited to the subject of antiquities, and more particularly to such things as may illustrate and relate to the history of Great Britain. And the Society of Antiquaries had a very strict focus on Great Britain in terms of their artefacts. That's going to be relevant in a moment. The Scottish Society was founded in 1780. To investigate both antiquities and natural and civic history in general, with the intention that the talents of humanity should be cultivated and that the study of natural and useful sciences should be promoted. So there's quite a gap between the founding of the two societies, and really as the 18th century progressed, people felt more strongly that a specific Scottish body was needed. And as you go into the 19th century, antiquarianism was really, it did have a political aspect to it because it really supported the idea of nationhood and identity, national identity and Scottish identity. I mentioned that they had different approaches though. So Society of Antiquaries of London really focused on Britain. The Society of Antiquaries of Scotland was interested in everything, absolutely everything. They would take anything. And I've got a few notes of some of the things that they took in for their museum. So some things very relevant. A letter signed by Mary Queen of Scots, but also in 1781, a donation of items from Captain Cook's last expedition, including Tahitian warriors' gorget, a Tongan reed panpipes, Chinese shoes, Tahitian items, bows from the Caribbean. So it's very closely connected to other kind of colonial donations, people that were going out to the colonies, bringing things back, people who were going on expeditions, bringing things back. So it became a sort of huge thing in terms of what it was that they collected. We also have to remember, when we think about antiquarian studies, is that if you're going out collecting, labelling, organising, you're not going to be wholly objective. You're going to, no matter how much you want to apply order and science, it could also be, it's subject to your personal assumptions, your personal projections, your viewpoint. That sort of idea of interpretation is also key to some of the arguments that happen following Britain's presentation. So the manuscript records of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland are held here in the Hes archives. On the right-hand side here, you can see an image, a photograph of the Museum of Antiquities. Many of you might recognise this as the portrait gallery. So when it was also built to house the Museum of Antiquities. And you can see just the sheer volume of stuff. David Starkey wrote an introduction to a book all about the Royal Society of London. And he talks about things. It's all about things. And I think that's actually quite a good reflection. It's about things. You look at them and you describe the thing that makes it thingy. So I quite like that description. On the left-hand side, we've got a couple of items from the Society of Antiquaries records and another item too. So antiquarian recording, it could be going out and getting something and bringing it back. But of course, a lot of the time for monuments, for archaeological sites, for buildings, it's more pictures of the things you're looking at. So in the top left corner here, we have a page from a notebook by Arthur Forbes. This is from 1838, and he's taken a picture of the Maiden Stone in Aberdeenshire. And I like this because very few of our drawings have people in them, and it's a really good use of a person for scale. I'm not sure it's a massively accurate scale of the person next to it, but it's really a really lovely drawing. His use of white to show the light reflecting off the side. We then have below that a sketchbook by James Skene, and these drawings are part of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland collection, showing both sides, so getting a much better idea of what both sides of it are, but with a bit of landscape in the background, which just makes it a little bit more attractive in terms of it as a picture rather than just a record. And then above that, we have a black and white photograph of a rubbing of the stone. This is by J. Romilly Allen from between 1890 and 1903. So in our collections here, we have a lot of, we have quite a lot of stone rubbings as well. So there were really lots of different ways that you could be recording things. Records, particularly of buildings, were often very detailed. So on the left here, we have a ground floor plan by the Reverend John Syme. Now we have quite a few items, quite a lot of his papers here in his archives. He was a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, and his records, he visited so many places, so Seaton Church, Roslin Chapel, St Andrew's Cathedral. But you can see the real bit of detail that he's included. He generally did floor plans and then a quick sketch of what the building looked like. He didn't do a lot of elevations of the upright, but he would do floor plans at different levels. So for Clackmannan Tower in Alloa, we have all the different floor plans of the different floors. This looks incredibly neat here, but the scrapbooks that we contain are very much scrapbooks. So unlike Arthur Forbes' beautiful sketchbook, he drew his plans on anything he had. We have plans drawn on the back of receipts, we have plans drawn on torn bits of paper, and then they were stuck into scrapbooks. The letter that we've got here is this is a letter from the Roslin Chapel Album. And this one is by the architect George Michael Kemp, and it's showing an elevation of Roslin Chapel. And it's got a lot of detailed measurements, it's got figure numbers, it's got letters to indicate it. Now, Kemp was, he's more of a designer than an architect. He is best known for winning the competition to design the Scott Monument. Sadly, he died before it was finished being built. But he was the designer of that, and he was really into Gothic architecture, and he had no formal training as an architect, as far as I'm aware. But here he has written to Syme with details. The key thing about Syme is that, about John Britton, he didn't actually visit Roslin that much himself. So a lot of this album is him writing to people going, could you send me some information? Could you go and do some drawings? Someone's criticised me for this after my talk. What could you help me with to argue against it? Or how have I not collated the correct evidence? It would sort of be a little like a bit of an embarrassing look at our email inbox if we made a mistake and then had to start messaging our friends going, is this actually correct? And what we do have on this is, I'll come to it a bit later, but there's another annotation on the top. So what's happened is Britton has received this letter, and then at a later date, he has sent it to John Thompson, who was the custodian of the chapel. He's written notes on it and he sent it back. And a bit further along, I've got a quote of what the notes are. So we've had a look at detailed drawings, sketches, rubbings, but the Society of Antiquaries also published and still publishes papers about members' research. We have physical copies of these here, but you can also read them online. The volume on the right-hand side, architect Andrew Kerr in 1877 presented a paper on Roslin Chapel, and it was actually just a year or two before he was appointed to carry out some work on the chapel himself. In his article, he puts it in the context of lots of other chapels that were all built around the same time in the 15th century. So Trinity College Church, St Salvador's Church in St Andrews, Seaton Church, Corstorphine Church. These were all built, just a few in the surrounding decades. But he does talk about how what sets Roslin apart is the profusion of decoration, or the extent of the peculiarities. And I think for many people, that is what is so alluring about Roslin itself. But one of the experts on Roslin Chapel today, Dr. Lizzie Swarbrick, she said that she's written that the iconography itself is not that unusual, but it's really the volume of the sculpture that makes it unusual, and some of the specific sculptures. But she also reminds us that the sculptures were there as a prompt for Sir William St Clair himself, and he would have understood their significance. I think one of the things that was lost during the Reformation is our contextual understanding of a lot of this Catholic sculpture in the church, its placement, how it would be read. Quite a lot of that information is lost to us. The society was dominated by men, not surprisingly, but it did admit women as lady associates. You can find lists of these at the beginning of the publications. Antiquarianism in general was generally a sort of hobby, although they might feel as a profession of the upper classes. And being able to take your own photographs was certainly an expensive thing to do. These photographs are by Lady Henrietta Gilmore. We have her papers here. And she was one of the lady associates. So here she's visited Roslin Chapel around 1900 and took this photograph. And on the other side, she's taken a photograph of some cottages in Corran Ferry. But these are very much photographs of the places that she went to visit. But photography was really a new medium for recording the past. And photographers Erskine Beveridge on the left here and William Donaldson Clark on the right were fellows of the Royal Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. So the sort of artistic membership of the society was quite wide in scope. I mentioned that antiquarian studies can be quite subjective, and that's the same for photography. Even when you think about documentary photography, you're still choosing what you document, you're choosing what to not document. I think this photo of the Ruthwell Cross is absolutely beautiful because it shows it in the church. And then on the right, we have Melrose Abbey. And again, we have these figures sitting in it. It gives a sense of scale, a sense of physicality, but also makes it a little bit more romantic, sitting amongst these ruins. These two men, we don't know why they're there, we don't know who they are or what they're talking about. But photography is also really closely aligned to tourism. I mentioned that obviously today Roslin Chapel is a huge tourist destination. I would say if you want to visit in the summer, you must book your ticket in advance. Photographic companies emerge from this because photographers recognise a market for collectible postcards, for photographic postcards that you could travel, you could add to your scrapbook at home. And these are some of the photographs that we hold in the archive from such commercial photography companies. And you can see that they have inscriptions of what they are, and they also have numbers, which suggests that you could keep track of which numbers did you have for which building. So on the left is a view of Roslin. Below that, we have Melrose Abbey. And then on the right is this really stunning photograph of the interior of Roslin Chapel. And these photos are by, the one on the right and lower left are by Scottish Colour Photo. They were based in Alexandria and Western Bartonshire. And we have almost 3,500 items from their records, most of which are glass plate negatives. George Washington Wilson, his company, here's the top left, We have a small number of those. And the majority of that collection is at Aberdeen University. The George Washington Wilson at Aberdeen University is 38,000 slides. He did not go and take all those pictures himself. So these commercial companies, they would employ photographers, send them out around Scotland to take their pictures. It wasn't just historic buildings. They would be taking photographs of landscapes or your contemporary views of towns and villages as seascapes, seaside resorts. But for us and for contemporary antiquarians, they were really useful records. Tourism also had a big impact on publishing, and when you have a look around the exhibition, you'll be able to see some of these publications, and not surprisingly, Roslin really got involved, were included in this very early on. So in the 1760s, there were just 7 published travel tours of Scotland. By 1820s, this had grown to 53, and then there was really an explosion of publication. The publications increasingly became smaller. You could carry them easily. They were cheaper to produce, cheaper to purchase. And publishers really made good use of photography. In Jameson's Guide to Roslin here, this is just a really small pamphlet. It's just engravings, but you can see on the booklets on the other side that photographs were used. And it was 1846 that Thomas Cook published the Handbook of a Trip to Scotland. And it's interesting, I mentioned that antiquarian studies and the travel was really limited to the upper classes, and there was a lot of resistance to this idea of tourism opening up spaces for people. And Thomas Cook wrote, "It's too late in this day of progress to talk such exclusive nonsense. God's earth, with all its fullness and beauty, is for the people. And railroads and steamboats are the result of the common light of science, and for the people also." Obviously, there were still huge numbers of the population who still couldn't afford to be doing this. So we're very much talking about the middle classes emerging during the Industrial Revolution, who were able to undertake these journeys. And Roslin was very much somewhere on the map to visit. So the last part of my talk is going to focus on really that controversy from Britain's Reba talk. And it's in the context of architectural restoration in the 19th century. And the figures in the album are really at the centre of this. So although good for tourism, the growth of the railways did pose a risk for historic buildings. It still does, if you think about HS2 and places that have had to be removed, moved, destroyed, demolished. And that was the case in Edinburgh. So Trinity College and Hospital were founded in 1460 by Mary of Geld, I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce it, in the memory of her late husband, King James II. It was begun just 14 years after Roslin Chapel, and similarly, it was incomplete. The buildings were located on Leith Wynd, and you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, that's its original location, an engraving of it in its original location. We have in the top left, these are some of the plans that Reverend John Syme made that are in his sketchbook. However, in 1846, the church and hospital were demolished to make way for Waverley Rail Station. Now, the Society of Antiquaries protested the demolition. They were one of the people trying to preserve the building. They recognised its value, but an Act of Parliament essentially allowed compulsory purchase order. So the church was actually dismantled stone by stone. All the stones were numbered, dismantled stone by stone under the supervision of architect David Bryce. He's important. And the intention was to rebuild it later. But actually, it didn't get rebuilt until around 1870. Many of the stones and sculptures had disappeared by then. And in the end, only part of it was rebuilt. What exists today is called Trinity Apse, and it is just the apse. More of it was built, but you can see in 1963, so this is where it had been rebuilt, even part of that was rebuilt was demolished. So it's a little bit of a sad story, Trinity College Church. So Roslin Chapel. 1736 to 1742, and you'll see there's a lot of things happen in about a 100-year period. General James St Clair commissioned repairs, and this was guided by an individual called John Clark of Pennycook, and the works were carried out by John Baxter. 100 years later, architect William Byrne was commissioned by the 3rd Earl of Roslin to remove the sloped roof. Now, the sloped roof, on the left-hand slide, I've done a yellow circle. If you visit the church and look up, you can see a mark where the sloped roof used to be. The sloped roof had been added by John Clark of Pennycook, and it obviously wasn't part of the original design for the building, and the 3rd Earl of Roslin got William Byrne to remove it. About 15 years later, David Bryce, who I mentioned a moment ago, he undertook substantial restorations and repairs to the chapel. It's really important to say that when you go into the chapel now and look at the stonework, it's very difficult to know which of that is original and which of that was recarved by David Bryce or replaced by David Bryce. And that's one of the challenges of reading the building, is you're reading it, but it's not necessarily, it doesn't look the same way that it looked when it was originally built because of all the damage that had happened. He also added the decorative stonework, and he undertook a really vigorous cleaning of the stonework and sculpture. Next year, 1861, the chapel was rededicated. 1868, the 4th Earl of Roslin added stained glass to the east window. And then in 1878, architect Andrew Kerr, who had written that article for the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, he was commissioned to survey the building, but also to design a new baptistry. So on the right-hand side, in the yellow circle, this is the new building, Andrew Kerr, and it's quite deliberately built at a different stone. It's visually very different. So that shows that there was a lot of things happening to the building during this period. Now, before Britton's lecture, he did do a fair bit of research. He didn't just go into Reba and start saying things that were unfounded. This is a transcription of part of the notes in the middle of this letter. So J.R. Thompson wrote, the drawing, appears to be erroneous, as the spandrel at the lowest part of the gutter is 2 feet above the Bessemer arch, which is protected by discharging arch 1. This discharging arch 1 appears to have been mistaken. As represented here, it would tend to assist the bulling of the Bessemer arch and has nothing in weight to counteract the uplifting of it. The counteraction of the resistance and bulging of the clear story walls appear to be in the reverse arch over aisle. So they're really looking at it in a lot of detail. And arguments about the chapel went down to this level of detail. You've drawn that wall 1 foot too far north, or it's not in the right place, or so-and-so hasn't measured this correctly. It's really about the detail. Now, the biggest controversy, what was so controversial about Britton's lecture? The correspondence in the Roslin Chapel album really demonstrates how emotive this issue was to people at the time. The disrepair of buildings was part of its allure. As you can see from this letter from David Roberts to John Britton. David Roberts attended the lecture, and his are some of the most agitated letters to John Britton afterwards. So he says, much to the credit of Lord Roslin, no expense has been spared to preserve this unique relic of a past age, having with this last few years undergone a thorough repair, but the opening of the great east windows is much to be regretted by the flood of light which is now let in upon its mouldering walls, and half the charm of its former appearance being derived from the Rembrandtish effect of its partially closed up windows. Which just feels very bizarre, because the windows were never meant to be covered. The windows were meant to be windows. But at that time, there was such a connection to the feeling of the building. And it was so, artists were so keen to draw it because of this atmosphere that was inside. So yeah, David Roberts was probably the person who's the most really upset at some of these things that were happening to it. Now, I mentioned about William Byrne. William Byrne was the architect that was employed to remove the sloping roof that had been added on. William Byrne, we actually have his collection, his records here in the archives. He was commissioned in 1826 to modernise and repair St Giles. So St Giles, as part of the sort of city clean-up, a lot of the adjoining buildings were demolished. And then actually realised that that was holding St Giles up to a certain extent. So William Byrne was responsible for stabilising the building. He cladded it. He raised the height of the nave, enlarged the aisle where the General Assembly of Scotland met. And it was after this that he was then employed to work on Roslin Chapel. And he did a lot of excavations in Roslin Chapel, particularly in both the crypt that's at the back of the chapel, but the crypt, i.e. underneath the chapel, we think. He said that he thought that the walls were unchanged, and he said that he didn't think sorry, I've just lost my place a moment. So David Roberts was really against what William Byrne said about the building, and he wrote to Britain, "I was not a little annoyed at the positive manner in which William Byrne asserted his belief that its present appearance was a part and part of the original design." Roberts actually thought some walls had been moved. Knowing this to be a hasty conclusion, without probably paying that attention to the subject as I had done myself, I considered it necessary for your credit as well as to my own to draw up the reasons for my belief of an alteration having taken place. His writing gets more and more scrappy as he gets more and more angry writing his letter. He also was very upset because Byrne, there was an account in Walter Scott's Lay of the Last Minstrel that said that 20 Roslin barons were buried beneath the chapel. And Byrne excavated and said, no, there's no barons, and there's no space that the barons could have been. So they weren't there. So he says this in his Reba lecture. They're not there. Roberts is outraged at this. He says, he sort of acknowledges, yes, Walter Scott's book is a fictional book. And then he says, I think if you turn your eye to the notes appended to that passage of the book, you will perceive that Father Hay, who wrote a history of the family of St Clair, not only confirms this, but gives a most intimate account of the appearance of the last baron who was interred in his armour when the vault was opened. So I talked about detail, and it's also about stories, how people interpreted. And just as I said, there's not really an object. You can't say that antiquarianism or architectural restoration was objective. It's still open to interpretation, although I think I would err on William Byrne's side. The photograph of the two workmen on the left is from David Bryce's later restoration of the 1860s. This is from our photographic collections here. So here you can see some of the ironwork that he added. And it was David Bryce that I mentioned who took a lot, who really cleaned and replaced quite a lot of the stonework. So I said it's very emotive, and David Bryce really got the brunt of it, of the criticism. And we're just coming to the end of the talk now, but for those of you that are here in person, you've got an opportunity to go around. We've got a lot more images on display in the exhibition. But I think this sort of entertaining but really strong in feeling letter to the Scotsman from 1861. And it's anonymous. The person just signed their name Randolph. If you have a look at the British Newspaper Archive, you can actually go and read the whole thing. It says, being in the neighbourhood the other day, I went where I shall certainly never go again, to the dear old chapel. And to my amazement, there stood the Prentice Pillar. The Prentice Pillar is another really important source of story and tale and mystery at Roslin Chapel, which we well remember, rich all over with the colours of the time, the cunning, ceaseless work of 200 years, scraped, peeled, flayed, standing raw and wretched, naked and ashamed. Any more lamentable result of this, of the nimia diligentia, I had to Google this, excessive care, which works such havoc in our world I never saw before. And I think there's a lot more than just Roslin that Randolph is upset about. The pillar is still there, diminished, of course, materially in diameter by this decortication, but its delicate, wonderful tints, its glory, its meaning, its teaching, its sacredness are gone. In this case, restoration is not preservation, but destruction. And in some ways, he was right. And I think we have to remember when building restoration happens, it reflects the thoughts at the time. So our conservators here now, when they're conserving works on paper, architectural plans, everything they do is visible, and everything they do could be undone if you wanted to undo it. So in the 1950s, the sacristy roof was repaired. The stained glass was added to the baptistry. The baptistry was that bit that was added on, designed by Andrew Kerr. In 1954, a report from the Ancient Monuments branch of the Ministry of Works recommended urgent conservation action, which included cleaning of the stones, grouting the gaps, and sealing with silica magnesium fluoride, coating the whole interior with lime wash. And just 40 years later, this proved to be really destructive. What happens with a building, and I've learned this from going to talks by some of the stonemasons in Hes, you need the building to be able to breathe, for water to be able to get out. And the magnesium fluoride and the lime wash just sealed it. And when water got in, it couldn't go anywhere. So for those of you that have visited Roslin kind of over the years, you may remember that a huge canopy went up over the building. I remember visiting when it had the canopy on it. And there was a huge major conservation project which was completed in 2016. But if you go today, you could still see that lime wash on top. It couldn't be removed. There is an interesting bit of wall, isn't there, where they tested different ways they might be able to remove it, but in the end decided not to. So that's the end of my talk, to just give you a little bit of a tour through the album and how it relates to our archives here and what its significance is and the things that we can learn from it.